For nearly a year, Dolly Parton told her fans almost everything except the one thing that actually mattered: kidney stones, a little dizziness, dehydration, grief over losing her husband. Word after word, video after reassuring video, she built a picture of an aging woman managing ordinary aches, nothing more. Then, on August 25th, 2026, she died at 80, and for a day the world was told simply that she'd passed peacefully in Nashville, no cause given. That silence didn't last. A spokesperson for her estate confirmed to the New York Times what her family had chosen not to say publicly. Dolly Parton had cancer. And the story she told her fans for the last year of her life was true in almost every detail, and still, somehow, not the whole truth at all. Go back to where this actually starts, because the timeline only makes sense once you see how far back the concealment goes. In September 2025, Parton announced she was postponing a planned Las Vegas residency. Her own words at the time were careful in a way that in hindsight reads less like vagueness and more like precision. She said she was dealing with health challenges and that her doctors told her she needed a few procedures. Notice what that sentence does. It's not a lie. Cancer treatment genuinely does involve procedures, but it's constructed so that anyone hearing it would picture something manageable, something routine, something an 80-year-old woman deals with and moves past. Nobody hearing that sentence in September 2025 would have guessed the word underneath it was cancer. A month later, in October, the carefully managed version of the story nearly slipped out of her control. Her younger sister, Frida Parton, posted on Facebook asking fans to pray for Dolly, saying she hadn't been feeling her best. That's a family member speaking without the same practiced caution Dolly herself was using. And it clearly registered as a risk, because the very next day Dolly released her own video to calm the alarm. She told fans she knew people were starting to think she was sicker than she actually was. Look at that sentence again now that you know what she knew and they didn't. She wasn't lying about how she felt in that moment. She was managing the gap between what her sister's fear had revealed and what she was willing to let the public understand. By March 2026, at the seasonal opening of Dollywood, the language shifted towards something heavier, and this is the point where, in retrospect, she came closest to telling the truth without ever using the word. She told the crowd she'd been worn down and worn out, and connected it explicitly to grief over her husband, Carl Dean, who had died the previous spring after nearly 6 decades of marriage. She said she was working to rebuild herself spiritually, emotionally, and physically. If you didn't know what was coming, that reads as an aging woman processing loss. If you do know what was coming, physically is doing a lot more work in that sentence than anyone in that crowd understood at the time. Then, in May 2026, she gave her most specific public disclosure, and it's worth sitting with exactly how specific it was, because it tells you precisely how much truth she was willing to hand over and where the boundary sat. She cancelled another Las Vegas show and named kidney stones, describing them, in her own words, as a condition so persistent that doctors dug more stones out of her in a year than a rock quarry back home in Tennessee. She went further, saying her immune system and her digestive system had been out of whack for 2 to 3 years, and that she and her doctors were working to rebuild and strengthen both. That timeline matters enormously now. 2 to 3 years reaches back well before any public health language at all, back before Carl's death, back before any of it. Whatever was actually happening inside her body had been developing quietly for years before she ever gave the public a single word about it. Here's where the confirmed reporting fills in what her own statements never did. TMZ reported that Parton had been hospitalized early on the Friday before her death, specifically for kidney and autoimmune issues. Those are the same 2 systems she'd been telling fans about for months: kidney stones, immune system out of whack. The words she'd been using publicly for over a year turn out to have been accurate all along, just incomplete, describing real symptoms while omitting the disease actually producing them. That's not really deception in the crude sense. It's closer to what she did with the Dollywood ride opening just weeks before she died, when she said she couldn't attend because her doctor advised against travel and she'd been feeling dizzy and dehydrated. Every individual sentence she ever gave the public checks out. What she withheld was the word that would have made all of those individual sentences suddenly cohere into a single, much more serious picture. She died at the Vanderbilt-Ingram Cancer Center in Nashville, surrounded by loved ones, according to the statement her representative released to People and confirmed to the Times. Her family described it as a brief battle with cancer. The specific type was not disclosed, and as of this reporting, still hasn't been. That word, brief, deserves scrutiny rather than just acceptance, because it sits awkwardly against everything else in the timeline. If the immune and digestive issues she described in May 2026 trace back 2 to 3 years, and if the September 2025 procedures were already connected to this same diagnosis, then brief is doing very specific, very deliberate work in that family statement. It's possible the disease itself progressed quickly, even after a long period of related symptoms. Cancers are frequently diagnosed only once they've reached an advanced stage, and an aggressive cancer discovered late can absolutely constitute a brief battle, even after years of preceding, less specific health trouble. It's also possible brief is simply the word a grieving family reaches for when they want the public to understand the ending without walking through the whole of it. Both readings are honest, neither can be confirmed from what's public right now. What can be said with more confidence is why she chose the language she did for as long as she did, because the pattern is remarkably consistent with who she'd been for 60 years. Dolly Parton built an entire public identity, from the earliest years of her career, around control of her image, her music publishing, her business empire, and above all, control of exactly what the audience got to see of her and when. She wrote her own songs and kept ownership of them when almost nobody in Nashville did that. She built Dollywood on her own terms in her own hometown region, rather than letting an entertainment conglomerate absorb her name. She was, by every account of people who worked with her, one of the most quietly strategic operators the entertainment industry ever produced, wrapped inside a persona so warm and unthreatening that almost nobody clocked the discipline underneath it. Managing a cancer diagnosis the same way she managed everything else in her public life, in careful, incomplete, entirely truthful pieces, isn't really an aberration. It's the same instinct she'd been running for 6 decades, applied one final time to the hardest material she'd ever had to work with. There's a version of this story where that instinct reads as troubling, a woman keeping her own fans in the dark about something they arguably had some claim to know, given how much of her identity she'd built on seeming to let them in. There's another version where it reads as exactly the kind of dignity she'd earned the right to. She spent a year telling her fans real, true things about her body while protecting the one piece of information that would have turned her final months into a death watch instead of a life she was still actively living, touring, working, showing up to open a theme park ride whenever she could. She chose, again and again, to give her audience updates rather than headlines. That's a distinction worth taking seriously rather than reducing to a simple story about a secret finally getting out. Go back to her sister's Facebook post in October 2025, the one moment the carefully managed story nearly cracked open early. Frida Parton wasn't managing anything. She was simply frightened for her sister and said so in public, the way anyone would. And Dolly's response the next day, calm, reassuring, slightly amused at the alarm, was the exact same instinct she'd apply for the next 10 months. Not a denial, a redirection. Now you know what she knew standing in front of that camera. She wasn't performing wellness she didn't feel. She was performing the specific careful incompleteness she'd apparently decided, at some point after her diagnosis, was the only honest way she could keep working, keep touring when she could, keep being Dolly Parton for as long as her body would let her, without turning every single public appearance into a referendum on how much time she had left. She died surrounded by loved ones at a cancer centre in the city that had been her home for most of her adult life, 17 months after losing the husband she'd spent nearly 60 years with. Her family called it brief. The public record, pieced together from her own year of careful language, suggests it was anything but brief underneath the surface, even if the final stretch genuinely was. The real cause of Dolly Parton's death, now that the word has finally been said out loud, doesn't actually change the story she was telling all along. It just gives you the one piece she'd been quietly leaving out of a story that, in every other respect, she told exactly as honestly as she'd told every story for 60 years. She just chose one last time which parts belonged to her and which parts belonged to everyone else.